The night Karen whispered those 4 words into my shoulder at 30,000 feet. I stopped breathing, not because I was afraid, but because in 3 years of working for the most emotionally unreachable woman I had ever met, 3 years of perfectly pressed reports, unanswered good mornings, and boardroom silences that could freeze a room, nothing had ever prepared me for the feeling of her weight leaning into me, her voice barely audible above the engine hum, whispering, "Stay still, don't move." She wasn't awake, not fully, but her hand, the same hand that had slid performance reviews across a desk without a single word of praise, had found the sleeve of my jacket and was holding on. And I sat there, 30,000 feet above the earth, afraid that one wrong breath would break whatever this was. I didn't move, I didn't sleep. I just sat there wondering how a woman who had never once looked at me like I was anything more than an employee had somehow, in the dark and quiet of a late-night flight, chosen my shoulder to fall apart on, and why that felt like the most important thing that had ever happened to me. Let me take you back to the beginning of that night. The flight was a late departure, 11:40 p.m., a red-eye to Chicago for a quarterly leadership summit that Karen had insisted we attend in person. She had sent the calendar invite 3 weeks prior with exactly 4 words in the subject line. "Don't be late, Charles." No greeting, no context, just the expectation of compliance. That was Karen. I had learned early in my tenure at Hargrove and Ellis that Karen Mitchell did not do warmth. She did results. She did precision. She did the kind of silence that made grown men rehearse their sentences twice before speaking. In 3 years, I had watched her walk into a boardroom and rearrange the entire energy of the room simply by setting her coffee down. She was extraordinary and completely unreachable. I had made my peace with that, or at least, I thought I had. We boarded separately. She was already seated when I found my row, window seat, of course. She had the aisle. The middle seat between us sat empty, which in retrospect felt almost deliberate, a buffer zone, a demilitarized territory. She didn't look up when I sat down. She was reviewing a document, her reading glasses perched at the edge of her nose, her pen moving in small, deliberate strokes across the margin. And then I noticed it. Something I had seen dozens of times in conference rooms, but never quite registered until that moment. Her fingers between annotations, her left hand rested against her forearm, and her index finger tapped, slowly, rhythmically, a quiet private metronome that she seemed completely unaware of. Tap, tap, tap. I had seen it before, during tense presentations, during difficult calls, during moments when the room was waiting on her decision. I always assumed it was impatience. But sitting this close, in the low amber light of the cabin, it didn't look like impatience. It looked like someone trying to hold themselves together. I looked away before she could catch me staring. The flight attendant moved through the cabin, dimming the overhead lights as we reached cruising altitude. Most passengers had already surrendered to sleep. The hum of the engine settled into something almost meditative, and the world outside the windows turned to pure, depthless black. I put my earphones in, closed my eyes, told myself to sleep. I was almost there when I felt it. A shift, subtle, the faint warmth of someone adjusting beside me. I opened one eye. Karen had removed her glasses. The document was folded on her tray table. Her head was tilted back slightly against the headrest, and her eyes were closed. The pen was still loosely held between 2 fingers, as though she had simply stopped mid-thought and let exhaustion take over without her permission, and even in sleep, or the beginning of it. Her finger was still tapping against her arm. Tap, 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 slower now, but still there. I watched her for a moment longer than I should have, because the woman sitting beside me in that dim cabin looked nothing like the woman who ran Monday morning meetings with the energy of a controlled detonation. She looked tired. Genuinely, deeply tired. The kind that a single night's sleep doesn't fix. The kind that lives behind your eyes and follows you into every room. I turned back to my window. Outside, somewhere below the clouds, the world was going about its business. And up here, in this pressurized quiet, my boss, the most composed person I had ever known, was slowly, quietly, falling apart at the edges. I didn't know it then, but that tapping finger was the first crack in the ice. And by the time we landed, nothing between us would ever be the same. I don't know exactly when she shifted. One moment she was upright, composed even in sleep, and the next, somewhere over the dark stretch of Ohio. I think. The cabin tilted slightly through a pocket of turbulence, and Karen's head dropped directly onto my shoulder. I froze. Every muscle in my body went still with the kind of careful, ridiculous precision you use when a bird lands on your hand and you're terrified of startling it. I held my breath. I stared straight ahead at the seatback in front of me, like it contained the answers to every question I had ever had about the universe. Her hair smelled like something quiet and expensive. Faintly floral. The kind of scent that doesn't announce itself but stays with you long after the moment has passed. The tapping had stopped. For the first time since I had known Karen Mitchell, everything about her was still. And then she whispered it. Stay still, don't move. Barely a sound. More breath than words. But I heard it the way you hear something that was meant for you even when it wasn't meant to be said out loud, so I stayed. I didn't move for the better part of an hour, and somewhere in that hour I think something shifted in me too. She woke slowly. I could feel the moment consciousness returned to her, a slight tension in her shoulders, a small intake of breath, the way her body registered where it was before her mind fully caught up, and then she lifted her head. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. I counted. Karen straightened, smoothed her blazer, touched her hair once with the back of her hand, and then she turned to look at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face before. It was somewhere between dignity and complete mortification. I should have said nothing. I knew that. The professionally correct response was to pretend it hadn't happened, to offer her the graceful exit of mutual silence. But something about the look on her face, that rare, unguarded crack in the armor, made my mouth move before my better judgment could stop it. That'll be $40, I said quietly. Standard shoulder rental fee. I accept card. She stared at me 1 beat, 2. And then, and I want to be precise about this because I had never seen it happen before in 3 years. Karen Mitchell almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive. It stopped just at the corner of her mouth, like it wasn't sure it had permission. But it was there. Add it to your expense report, she said. Under miscellaneous. I laughed. Softly so I wouldn't wake the other passengers, and she looked mildly offended by my amusement, which somehow made it funnier. You didn't drool. For the record, I offered. I want you to know I considered lying about that, but I decided to be professional. She turned to look at me slowly, the way a person looks at someone who is testing the absolute boundaries of acceptable behavior. How generous of you, she said flatly, but her eyes, and this is the part I keep coming back to, her eyes were warm. Just for that moment, just in that small, pressurized world above the clouds where the normal rules seemed temporarily suspended. We didn't talk about what had just happened. We didn't name it or examine it or do anything responsible with it. We just sat in the quiet together, the cabin dark around us, and for the first time in 3 years, the silence between Karen and me didn't feel like distance. It felt like something else entirely, something I wasn't ready to name yet. But something I was absolutely certain I didn't want to lose. The cabin had settled into that particular kind of quiet that only exists at altitude. The kind where the world below feels entirely theoretical, and the only things that are real are the ones within arm's reach. The low hum of the engines, the occasional soft chime of a distant call button, the pale blue glow of a screen 3 rows ahead, and Karen sitting beside me turning her coffee cup slowly in both hands without drinking from it. We had been talking, quietly, carefully, the way you talk when you're not entirely sure how you got to this place with this person, but you're aware enough to know that one wrong word could end it. We had moved from the expense report joke to the summit agenda to a surprisingly honest disagreement about whether Chicago deep dish qualified as actual pizza. She had opinions, strong ones, delivered with the same precision she applied to quarterly forecasts. I found it unreasonably charming. And then, in the middle of a sentence about something entirely unimportant, she stopped. Just stopped. Set her coffee cup down. Looked at the tray table. I haven't slept properly in 4 months, she said. Not to me exactly. More like to the space in front of her. Like she hadn't planned to say it and wasn't entirely sure she had until the words were already out. I didn't respond immediately. I had learned, in small moments like this, that Karen Mitchell didn't need you to fill her silences. She needed you to hold them, so I held it. I didn't realize it was that long, she continued, quieter now. Until just now, when she stopped again. Her finger found her forearm. Tap, 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 when I actually slept. She said the last word like it surprised her. Like sleep had become such a foreign country that 40 minutes on a stranger's. On my shoulder had felt like crossing a border she had forgotten existed. I watched her finger tapping and said, as gently as I could manage, "That thing you do with your finger, does it help?" She looked down at her hand as though she had been caught doing something private, which, I suppose she had. "I don't." She paused. "I'm not always aware that I'm doing it." "I know," I said. "I've noticed it for a while." Something moved across her face, not discomfort, something more complicated than that. "How long?" she asked. "About 2 years. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Softer, more careful. "It started when my mother got sick," she said finally. And there it was, not the whole truth. I could feel that instinctively, the way you sense a room has more doors than the ones you can see. But a piece of it, real and unpolished and clearly something she had not said out loud to very many people, maybe anyone. I didn't push, I didn't ask the obvious follow-up questions, I just said, "I'm sorry, Karen." And she nodded once, a small, controlled nod that I recognized as the Karen Mitchell version of falling apart. Her finger kept tapping. Faster now, the rhythm losing its steadiness. And then she drew a breath, straightened her spine, and I watched her put herself back together in real time, watched the professional composure return, like a curtain being drawn across a window. "We should go over the summit agenda," she said. Her voice was smooth again. Measured, just like that. The door closed, but before it did, in the last half-second before she rebuilt the wall, she looked at me. And what I saw in that look was not the woman who ran boardrooms and sent forward emails. It was someone carrying something enormous. Alone, and I made a quiet decision, somewhere above the clouds, that I was no longer willing to let her. If this story is staying with you the way it's staying with me, go ahead and hit that like button. Because the next part changes everything. We landed in Chicago at 2:17 a.m. The summit didn't begin until 9, which meant there were several hours of hotel corridors and quiet elevators, and the particular awkwardness of two people who had shared something real trying to reinsert themselves into their professional roles. Karen was already Karen again by the time we collected our bags. Composed, precise. She confirmed the morning schedule with me in the elevator, referenced 2 agenda items she wanted to revisit before the opening session, and said goodnight at her door with the same measured professionalism she might use to close a meeting. No warmth, no acknowledgement of the flight. Just goodnight, Charles. 7 a.m. breakfast. Don't be late. I stood in the hallway after her door closed and told myself this was fine. That what happened on the plane was what it was. A tired woman and a convenient shoulder and a conversation that the altitude had made feel more significant than it actually was. I almost believed it. I couldn't sleep. By 5 in the morning I had given up trying, dressed, and taken my coffee to the small business lounge on the 4th floor. I needed quiet and a table and something to do with my hands. What I found instead was a conversation I was never supposed to hear. The lounge had a partial partition, frosted glass, and a low dividing wall that created the illusion of privacy without actually providing it. I had settled into a chair on one side before I realized there were 2 people speaking in low, urgent tones on the other. I recognized the first voice immediately. Richard Hargrove, senior partner, the man whose name was on the building. I didn't recognize the second voice, but I caught enough. "The board is concerned about her capacity to continue. The situation with her mother has been going on longer than she disclosed. We need someone positioned to step in seamlessly if she formally steps down. Charles' merit has shown considerable." I stopped breathing. I set my coffee cup down very slowly and stared at the frosted glass partition and tried to process what I was hearing with some degree of rational clarity. Karen was stepping down, not because she wanted to. Because something, the situation with her mother, the 4 months without sleep, the weight I had seen in her eyes on that plane, had pushed her to a place where the company had noticed. And the company, in its infinite corporate sensitivity, had already begun identifying her replacement, me, without my knowledge, without my consent, and without Karen having any idea that the man she had fallen asleep on the night before was being quietly positioned to take everything she had built. I left the lounge before Richard Hargrove could turn the corner and find me there. The summit passed in a blur. I watched Karen present. She was flawless, controlled and commanding, and completely without evidence of the woman who had whispered, "Stay still," in the dark of a cabin. She fielded questions with surgical precision. She laughed exactly once, at exactly the right moment. She was, by every visible measure, completely fine, and I sat 3 seats away from her knowing that she wasn't, knowing that she was protecting a secret that was already an open door in the rooms above her. Knowing that by the time we returned to the office, the rumor had apparently already begun to circulate, that Charles Merritt and Karen Mitchell had traveled together, that they had been seen in close conversation, that perhaps the relationship was something other than professional, and that perhaps Charles Merritt stood to benefit from Karen Mitchell's departure. By Wednesday morning, 2 colleagues had looked at me differently. By Thursday, someone had said it out loud, and Karen, the woman who had let me hold her silence at 30,000 feet, had stopped meeting my eyes entirely. Don't go anywhere. What happens next? I almost didn't survive it. By Friday, the silence between us had become its own kind of weather, cold, pressurized, the kind that sits in a room before a storm and makes everyone in it subtly aware that something is about to break. Karen had not spoken to me directly in 4 days. Not beyond the functional minimum. Forwarded emails, a single 2-line response to a report I had submitted, a brief nod in the hallway that she distributed with the same neutral efficiency she gave to everyone else within eyeline. I had become nobody again, and the worst part, the part that kept me awake at 4 in the morning staring at the ceiling, was that I understood why. She was protecting herself the only way she knew how, the same way she had always known how, by becoming unreachable, by building the wall higher and smoother, and making sure there were no handholds left for anyone to climb. I understood it, and I hated it. On Friday evening, I found her in the office long after everyone else had gone home. This was not unusual. Karen was always the last to leave. But tonight the floor was completely empty, the overhead lights motion censored down to their dim after-hours setting, and she was sitting at her desk with no documents in front of her, just her hands, folded on the desk, and her finger, tapping faster than I had ever seen it. I knocked on the open glass door. She looked up, and for just a fraction of a second, before the composure arrived, I saw it, the exhaustion, the fear, the particular loneliness of someone who has decided that needing people is a liability they cannot afford. "Charles." Her voice was even. "I was just leaving." "No, you weren't," I said. She looked at me with the expression she reserved for people who had said something she considered professionally inadvisable. "I walked in anyway." "I know about the board conversation," I said. "I know what they're planning, and I need you to know that I had nothing to do with it. I didn't ask for it, I didn't want it, and I would never." "It doesn't matter," she said, quietly, too quietly. "It matters to me, Charles." She said my name like a period at the end of a sentence. Final, closed, Karen. I said hers like a question. The silence stretched between us. Her finger kept tapping against the back of her hand. And I did something then that I had no professional framework for, no rehearsed words to accompany. I crossed the room, sat down in the chair across from her desk, and simply said, "Tell me about your mother." Her breath caught. It was barely audible, the smallest involuntary sound. But in the silence of that empty office, it was as loud as anything I had ever heard. She looked at me for a long moment, and I watched her fight it. Watched her reach for the composure that had protected her for so long. And I held her gaze and didn't look away and didn't fill the silence and didn't give her anything to deflect against. Just stayed, the way she had asked me to stay on the plane, and slowly, so slowly, her shoulders dropped. "She has dementia," Karen said. "Early onset. She was diagnosed 8 months ago." Her voice was careful, measured, but her finger had stopped tapping. "I've been managing her care, restructuring my schedule, trying to." She stopped, drew a breath, trying to hold everything together without anyone knowing that I couldn't. "Why?" I asked, gently. She looked down at her hands. "Because in this company," she said, "vulnerability is a resignation letter." I leaned forward. "Not with me," I said. "It never has been. And when I reached across the desk and covered her hand with mine, her finger, that quiet, constant, desperate little rhythm, finally completely stopped. She looked at our hands, then at me, and for the first time since I had known Karen Mitchell, she didn't rebuild the wall, she just stayed. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because the ending will stay with you long after you've finished watching. 5 years is a strange and beautiful thing. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with ceremony or punctuation. It accumulates quietly, in shared grocery lists and inside jokes, and the particular way another person learns to move around you in a kitchen without either of you having to think about it. 5 years looks like Sunday mornings. It looks like a small house on the edge of a neighborhood with too many trees and not enough streetlights, which Karen chose specifically because she said the dark made the stars visible. And I said that was the most poetic thing she had ever said. And she told me to stop being dramatic and handed me a box to carry. It looks like that. It is a Sunday evening in October when I find myself sitting on our living room couch, the lamp in the corner throwing everything in warm amber, the television on at a volume that neither of us is actually listening to. Karen is beside me. Her legs are tucked beneath her, a habit she developed somewhere in the first year of us, when she finally stopped sitting like she was in a board meeting and started sitting like she was home. Her head finds my shoulder the way it has learned to, the way it knows to now, without negotiation or hesitation. And on the baby monitor on the coffee table, the soft, steady breathing of our daughter, Ellie, 18 months old, currently asleep with the absolute authority of someone who has decided the world can wait. She has Karen's eyes and my stubbornness, which Karen says is the most dangerous combination she has ever encountered, and I take as the highest compliment I have ever received. I feel it before I look down, that gentle, familiar rhythm against my arm. Tap, tap Karen's finger moving slowly against the fabric of my sleeve. She doesn't know she's doing it, she never fully does. But I have learned over 5 years to read it the way you learn to read weather, what it means when it's fast, what it means when it's slow, what it means when it stops. Tonight it's slow, which means she's thinking. "How's your mother?" I ask quietly. Not because I don't know. I had driven her to the memory care facility myself that morning, sat with her while Karen read to her from a novel she probably wouldn't remember by Tuesday but smiled at anyway. I ask because Karen sometimes needs the door opened from the outside. She exhales slowly. She knew me today, she says. For about 20 minutes, she called me by my name and asked if I was eating enough. A pause, and then she didn't, and I sat with her anyway. "I know," I say. "I was there, I know you were." She says it softly, like it still surprises her, like after 5 years she is still quietly astonished by the fact of someone staying. I press my lips to the top of her head. She covers my hand with hers, and beneath her palm, I feel her finger slow its tapping until it stops completely. The way it always does now when she remembers she doesn't have to hold herself together alone. The monitor crackles softly. Ellie shifts in her sleep, and Karen lifts her head just enough to look at me, really look at me, with those eyes that once kept the entire world at a professional distance and now hold everything she has. "Stay still," she says, quietly, almost smiling. I recognize the words. I will always recognize them. They were the first real thing she ever said to me, 30,000 feet above the earth in the dark, before either of us knew what we were becoming. "Don't move." I finish, and I don't. I wouldn't dream of it. Some people come into your life like turbulence, unexpected, disorienting, and completely necessary. If this story found you at the right moment, leave a comment below and tell me what it made you feel. And if you know someone who needs to be reminded that vulnerability is not weakness, share this with them today. We'll see you in the next one.